Story 1: The Endless Bow. The Etiquette of Greeting the Sultan. It began, as so many Ottoman matters did, with the simple act of standing still. You are in the great hall of Topkapi Palace, a place more silent than sacred, filled not with the clatter of swords or the rustle of silks, but with the invisible pressure of expectation. The sunlight drifts through latticed windows, glancing off the marble floors polished by centuries of slippered feet. 100 men stand motionless, their heads slightly bowed, their hands clasped at their waists, not praying, not serving, but waiting. In the Ottoman court, the act of greeting was not a greeting at all, but a performance, a silent, measured ritual that could take hours to execute. The Sultan, veiled by layers of hierarchy and custom, was less a person than a presence. To greet him was to acknowledge not the man but the weight of the empire itself, its bureaucracy, its divinity, its suffocating formality. And so when the Sultan entered a room, no one dared to look up. You bowed, but not too deeply. You paused, but not too long. The wrong angle of a neck or a step taken too soon could be mistaken for insolence or rebellion. The Ottomans, like many empires, built their power on ceremony. Yet what made them unique was the degree to which that ceremony consumed life itself. The court etiquette was not merely about reverence, it was about control. The act of bowing became a language, and every movement from the tilt of a head to the folding of a robe was a line in that wordless script. Foreign ambassadors, arriving from Venice or France, found the protocol maddening. One Venetian envoy in the 16th century recorded that he spent 3 full days rehearsing his approach to the Sultan's throne room, under the supervision of the chief of ceremonies. He was instructed on where to place his right foot, how long to hold his bow, and when to breathe. The slightest deviation could result in the cancellation of the audience altogether. One ambassador fainted mid-ceremony, overcome not by heat, but by the terror of getting it wrong. To you, standing in that vast, perfumed hall, time seems to dissolve. You hear the distant drip of a fountain in the courtyard, the faint creak of leather, the soft hiss of silk against stone. The bow is held. The air thickens. The Sultan, invisible behind his lattice screen, may not even be watching. Yet everyone behaves as if the eyes of history itself were fixed upon their spines. It is said that the Ottoman bow was born from a fusion of Persian courtly tradition and Islamic humility. The early sultans, influenced by Seljuk and Mongol customs, emphasized the act of adab, proper conduct, as a reflection of moral order. Over time, the simplicity of that idea metastasized into something almost theatrical. By the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent, the bow had become an emblem of imperial perfection. The more still one stood, the more loyal one appeared. The most senior officials, the viziers, the aghas, the janissary commanders, learned to bow without emotion. Their faces became like masks, drained of individuality. Even the Sultan's own sons, those born to power, were expected to prostrate themselves in absolute silence. There was no handshake, no embrace. In the empire of ceremony, warmth was weakness. The historian Evliya Celebi, who spent decades chronicling the Ottoman world, wrote of one audience where the Sultan's approach took over an hour. The procession advanced by inches, first the eunuchs, then the guards, then the bearers of the imperial sword, and finally the Sultan himself. By the time he reached his throne, half the assembly had fainted from exhaustion, yet not one dared to move. The silence, Evliya wrote, was like that of the grave. And still the bow endured. For some, it became almost spiritual, a meditation on discipline. For others, it was pure torment. A British envoy in the 18th century, James Porter, described how Ottoman courtiers bowed not from reverence but from habit, as if their very joints had been trained to servitude. The body, he observed, learned obedience before the mind ever did. But to truly understand the Ottoman bow, one must see it not as a gesture of submission, but of survival. Every official, every servant, every visitor to the palace understood that the empire was built on appearances. The Sultan's favor could shift in a moment, and the line between loyalty and treason was drawn in the subtlest of movements. To bow correctly was not merely to show respect, it was to remain alive another day. The irony, of course, was that the Sultan himself rarely bowed to anyone. His stillness was his power. To those who watched him, it seemed divine. But behind that stillness lay a kind of weariness, the fatigue of a man trapped in his own ritual. Even the Sultan was a prisoner of the ceremony that exalted him. He could not speak freely, eat freely, or even laugh without consequence. The endless bow was a mirror, reflecting both the grandeur and the absurdity of imperial rule. At times, the ceremony became farce. One chronicler noted an incident where a new court official, nervous and inexperienced, bowed too quickly and accidentally struck his head on the marble floor. The sound echoed through the hall like a gunshot. No one moved to help him. The Sultan did not blink. The man remained on the ground for the remainder of the ceremony, bleeding quietly into his turban. Afterward, he was commended for his zealous devotion. The ritual's monotony had a purpose. It lulled those within the court into a rhythm of obedience. There was comfort in repetition. Predictability, after all, was safety. The Ottoman bureaucracy depended on predictability, on the idea that every gesture, every phrase, every object had its proper place. The bow, in its stillness, reinforced that illusion of eternal order. And yet within that order, small rebellions occurred. A slightly shallower bow, a slower descent, a glance that lingered too long. These were the quiet languages of dissent, the only form of resistance allowed in a world ruled by etiquette. Historians still debate whether these tiny deviations ever truly mattered. Perhaps they didn't. But for those who lived beneath the shadow of the Sultan's gaze, they were everything. So when you imagine the Ottoman court, don't think of grandeur or power. Think of stillness, the kind that seeps into bones and breath, the kind that transforms men into statues. The endless bow was not just a ritual. It was a philosophy, that to survive under power, one must learn to become invisible. And yet, what happens when an empire built on stillness begins to move? When the bow no longer holds meaning, and silence loses its authority. To the untrained eye, the Ottoman court may have appeared as a tableau, a living painting of robes, turbans, and impassive faces. But if you looked long enough, you would begin to notice the movements hidden within stillness. There were patterns minute and practiced, the shuffle of soft slippers over stone, the faint swish of a caftan being adjusted, the imperceptible incline of a head from one degree to another. Each action held weight. Each movement was encoded with meaning. In the imperial council chamber, the Divan letter 131 Humyan, it was the Grand Vizier who most often spoke, but even he moved with restraint. Behind a golden grille, the Sultan would sometimes sit in silent observation, completely unseen by those deliberating below. Whether he was present or not remained uncertain, and that uncertainty reinforced the etiquette of every bow, every pause, every gesture. To bow was to acknowledge the possibility of being watched. To bow correctly was to behave as if you always were. This obsession with presence and form extended beyond courtly ceremonies into daily bureaucracy. Even something as mundane as presenting a petition required a script. A supplicant would first bow before the gate of felicity, the inner courtyard entrance to the Sultan's private domain. Then, upon approach to the Rais Effendi, or chief scribe, he would repeat the gesture, but now with a slightly deeper incline. He would not speak unless spoken to. His request would be handed over on folded parchment, never directly to the Sultan. Direct contact, after all, was inconceivable. The chain of ceremony insulated power from the people who served it. These repetitive formalities served a purpose. They slowed down the machinery of empire. In a world where hasty decisions could topple dynasties, the Ottomans cultivated delay as a virtue. Ceremony made time stretch, and within that stretching, space was created for reflection, for politics, or simply for the preservation of hierarchy. Even the Janissaries, elite soldiers trained for war, bowed according to strict protocol. Though they were fierce in battle, within the palace their movements became choreographed, ritualized. They too bowed before their superiors, a gesture made not with the heart, but with drilled precision. The irony was not lost on observers. The empire's most feared warriors were also its most carefully mannered servants. There were levels to the bow. A common subject bowed with his torso, a high official bowed with the shoulders, a slave bowed at the waist, and a rebel, even in defeat, might refuse to bow at all, a final act of resistance often punished with execution. Some governors in the provinces trained their household staff to bow 3 times before speaking, not because they enjoyed the gesture, but because it reinforced the idea that even the air between words must carry authority. The bow seeped into architectural design. The very layout of Topkapi Palace was built around thresholds and vantage points designed to manage deference. Paths were curved rather than direct. Entrances were staggered to slow a visitor's approach. No one walked in a straight line toward power. They wound their way toward it, deferring even in motion. Take, for example, the famed Imperial Gate, Bab letter 131 Humyan. Its arched grandeur gave way to the first courtyard, where only workers, cooks, and servants lingered. Beyond this was the Gate of Salutation, where soldiers and officials bowed to enter. Finally, there stood the Gate of Felicity, leading to the Sultan's private domain, a threshold so sacred that even viziers hesitated to cross without permission. Each gate was not just a barrier of stone, but of custom. One bowed to pass through them, sometimes twice. Even when seated, the Sultan was greeted with full-body prostration. Hands extended forward, head touching the floor, the double bow, used only in audiences of great importance. Those allowed to enter the Ars Audaci, the audience chamber, did so in absolute silence. The silence, as always, spoke louder than words. Before uttering a sentence, they bowed once. Before handing over a letter, they bowed again. And when dismissed, they backed away, still bowing until they were out of sight. And yet, amidst this ocean of etiquette, a curious shift began to occur in the later centuries of the empire. Western envoys increasingly pushed back against the bow. Influenced by Enlightenment ideals and the growing concept of equal sovereigns, diplomats from Britain, France, and Austria started to question the necessity of such rituals. They claimed that bowing too deeply to the Sultan or to any monarch was contrary to the dignity of their own states. The Ottoman court, of course, did not take kindly to this. In one famous case in the 19th century, the British ambassador Lord Stratford de Redcliffe refused to perform the prescribed triple bow during an audience. His stance caused uproar within the divan, but rather than force the issue, the Sultan allowed it. Not out of concession, but calculation. Ottoman power was shifting. So too was its relationship with formality. The bow, once a tool of survival, had begun to weaken. Part of this was practical. The court was changing. The 19th century brought administrative reforms known as the Tanzimat, an attempt to modernize the empire's structure. With them came new laws, ministries, and imported ideas. Western suits began replacing robes in the upper ranks of government. Chairs appeared where floor cushions once ruled. The bow itself, that great symbol of ceremonial subjugation, was slowly replaced by the handshake. But not everywhere. In provincial courts and among older officials, the bow lived on. So did the silence, the stillness, and the endless rehearsals. In remote districts, petitions were still folded with care and delivered with bowed heads. Local rulers clung to the rituals as evidence of legitimacy. In their view, modernity was no substitute for deference. And what of the Sultan himself? Even as his powers diminished, he remained a symbol, his posture, his stillness, still commanding reverence. But his world grew smaller. As railroads connected distant provinces and newspapers began reporting on the doings of the state, the need for secrecy and ceremony began to wane. Where once the bow was sacred, now it was sometimes mocked. A satirical cartoon from a late Ottoman journal showed a procession of bowed officials so bent forward that they couldn't see where they were going. Behind them, the Sultan stood on a box to appear taller. The caption read, "All as it should be." Still, the ritual had left its mark. Even when the act disappeared, the instinct remained. to pause before speaking, to measure one's breath, to bow if not with the body, then with the mind. And yet, within that gradual erosion of etiquette lies a deeper question. If the rituals of power vanish, do we grow closer to our leaders? Or do we merely stop recognizing who holds power at all? The bow, in its long and winding history, did not end with a grand declaration or a dramatic reform. Like so many rituals woven into the fabric of empire, it faded quietly, not with resistance, but with gradual neglect. By the late 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was a different entity than it had been in its golden age under Suleiman the Magnificent. Its reach had diminished, its borders were drawn by war and diplomacy, and its court rituals, once the defining heartbeat of imperial life, had begun to lose their grip. But the residue of those rituals lingered, etched into habits, into postures, into the way a man lowered his voice in the presence of authority. The Ottoman palace had once been a place where time moved differently, where an hour could stretch for the length of a single bow. Now, clocks hung in council chambers and meetings were scheduled with minutes. Officials came and went with less ceremony, more urgency. Ministers in Western-style uniforms no longer performed the triple bow. They nodded a simple, utilitarian gesture. It saved time, and time now was money. Even the Sultan, once the fixed point around which the imperial world turned, was subject to the gravitational pull of modernity. Sultan Abdulhamid II, who ruled from 1876 to 1909, was known for his paranoia as well as his pragmatism. He recognized the symbolic value of ceremony, but he also saw its limitations. Though he clung to certain courtly rituals, he increasingly governed from the shadows, retreating into the private chambers of Yildiz Palace, away from the grand processions and gilded etiquette of his predecessors. Yet behind the walls, echoes of the bow remained. New servants were still trained in silence. Visitors still approached with measured steps. Even as the world outside moved faster, the inside of the palace resisted a cocoon of the old world, slowly unraveling. The Enderun, the imperial school that once trained the empire's elite administrators in decorum and etiquette, had become a mere formality itself. Where once students practiced the bow as part of a moral and political education, they now studied foreign languages, finance, and constitutional law. The art of the bow was no longer a necessity, it was an antiquated dance, performed occasionally for the benefit of foreign guests, or for nostalgia. By the time the Second Constitutional Era began in 1908, the Ottoman court was already buckling under the pressures of modern politics. The Young Turks, a group of reform-minded officers and bureaucrats, demanded limits on the Sultan's power. They sought a parliament, elections, and perhaps most symbolically, transparency. Secrecy was no longer fashionable, and with the death of secrecy came the death of ceremony. To bow was to submit to mystery, but mystery in a constitutional government had no place. When Sultan Abdulhamid II was deposed in 1909, he left the palace not through the gate of felicity, but in a simple carriage under military escort. There were no bowed heads, no silence, no procession of incense and eunuchs. The empire had changed, and with it the way one greeted power. His successor, Maimed V, was little more than a figurehead. Ceremonies were still held in his name, but they were largely symbolic, like the empire itself, which was now kept alive through alliances and loans more than ritual and reverence. Still, old habits persisted. A bow here, a pause there, traces of the past clinging to the edges of change. And then came the war. World War I shattered what remained of Ottoman grandeur. The palace, once a fortress of ceremony, became a relic. The courtiers scattered, the treasury drained. Bowing seemed absurd in a world of tanks and telegrams. The Sultan's robes gave way to military uniforms and gray suits. Power was no longer embodied, it was elected, imposed, or seized. When the empire finally collapsed in 1922 and Mustafa Kemal Atatürk declared the Turkish Republic, the very notion of bowing before a leader was cast aside with forceful intent. Atatürk, a man of secular modernist vision, rejected all forms of Ottoman imperial ritual. His government banned fezzes, reformed the alphabet, and abolished the sultanate altogether. There would be no more divan, no more ars audaci, no more courtiers bowing into marble floors. In the new Turkey, you shook hands. And yet, even as the bow disappeared from public life, it remained subtly, quietly in the behaviors of people. A slight dip of the head when greeting an elder, a respectful silence in the presence of authority. These were not remnants of submission, but of continuity. The gesture lived on, stripped of its imperial weight, transformed into something gentler, a signal of respect, not fear. Today, visitors walk the grounds of Topkapi Palace and see only stillness. Tourists snap photographs in rooms where once no one dared speak aloud. The audience chamber is empty now. The cushion where the Sultan once sat is faded. The ornate gates remain shut, and the marble floors are polished not by slippers but by countless passing feet. There is no one left to bow to. But as you stand there in that great hall, with its painted ceilings and heavy silence, you can almost feel it. The weight in the air, the invisible eyes, the hush before a movement. You can almost hear the rustle of robes, the soft clink of ceremonial swords, the breath held for 1 second longer than necessary. And in that breath, in that pause, lives a memory of a world where silence was power, where stillness was obedience, and where a simple bow could mean everything. So what was the point of all this ceremony? Why invest centuries of time and training into a gesture that ultimately vanished? Perhaps because it wasn't about the bow itself. It was about what the bow prevented: chaos, spontaneity, unpredictability. It was about order. And order, for an empire built across 3 continents, mattered more than any sword or decree. But when that order crumbled, so too did the need for stillness. The final bow of the Ottoman Empire was not witnessed by a crowd, nor recorded by a chronicler. It happened quietly, in the heart of a palace that no longer ruled. Performed not by a man, but by time itself. Bending slowly, solemnly, toward the inevitable. Story 2. The Soap Wars of the Imperial Baths. You may think of soap as nothing more than a bar on the edge of your sink, a neutral object, an afterthought. But in the Ottoman Empire, particularly in the hushed, tiled chambers of the imperial hammam, soap was everything. To understand the peculiar politics of Ottoman bathing, you must enter the hammam not as a guest, but as a participant. The domed ceilings drip condensation. The marble floors warmed from beneath, amid a soft, radiant heat that envelops your bare feet. Every sound is muffled, not silent, but softened by steam and thick stone walls. And at the center of it all, soap. More specifically, who made it, who provided it, who owned it, and what it meant. The Ottoman hammam, or bathhouse, was not just a place to cleanse the body. It was a political, social, and economic institution, regulated down to the smallest detail. And within the palace complex, particularly in the harem-i-Humyan, the private domain of the Sultan and his family, bathing was bound by an intricate web of etiquette, hierarchy, and ritual. Soap in this context was not a commodity, it was a tool of rank. Palace soaps were not uniform. They came in various compositions, olive oil-based, scented with rose, jasmine, sandalwood, or clove. Some were infused with ambergris or musk. Others were wrapped in embroidered silks, shaped into ornate geometric molds and reserved for specific individuals such as the Sultan's mother, the Valide Sultan, or the Sultan's favored consort. You did not simply lather yourself. You were washed by designated attendants trained in a delicate balance of pressure, temperature, and humility. And here is where the wars began. The Imperial Soap Wars, as they came to be known in palace lore, though not formally chronicled, were a series of quiet, persistent rivalries between factions within the palace staff over the sourcing, allocation, and even type of soaps permitted for use in the imperial baths. At the center of it all was the Qais Astasi, the master of the scrubbing cloth. This person, usually an elder eunuch or trusted servant, controlled access to soaps in the hammam. He was not a man of wealth, but of influence. He knew who was permitted sandalwood and who must settle for lavender. He kept the tallies, controlled the inventories, and mediated disputes between bath attendants known as telaks, many of whom came from prominent bathhouse guilds in Istanbul. And in a palace where scent was status, soap was the most fragrant signifier of all. A favored concubine receiving amber-scented soap was understood to be in the sultan's good graces. A consort relegated to plain olive soap was clearly falling out of favor. Gossip spread not through whispers, but through lather. Even eunuchs observed these changes closely, adjusting their own allegiances and manners accordingly. The soap itself was often handmade in Anatolia, particularly in the cities of Aleppo, Bursa, and Edirne, where master soap makers belonged to guilds with roots stretching back centuries. These guilds, known as sabuncular lankasi, operated under strict rules. Their products were judged not only by cleanliness but by texture, scent, and longevity of foam. At least once a year, guild representatives would be summoned to the palace to present samples for approval. This was known as the Sabun Teshrifi, the soap presentation. It was not a formal audience, but it might as well have been. Soap makers would wrap their finest bars in embroidered cloths, carried in polished wooden boxes, and present them before palace eunuchs. The selections would then be passed on without words to the women of the harem, who would test them and return verdicts through intermediaries. A good verdict could elevate a soap maker's standing, secure him palace contracts, and ensure his guild priority status for the coming year. A poor showing could destroy a career. But even more complex were the internal rivalries. Within the palace, each powerful woman had her preferred soap and her preferred telak, and if another consort dared to request the same soap, it was considered a silent challenge, a form of mimicry that bordered on insult. These minor offenses escalated quickly. One consort would find her soap missing. Another would receive hers cut in half. A third might discover a subtly inferior substitute in her bathing tray. These were not accidents. They were warnings. Soon, petitions were being filed with the Kisler Agassi, the chief black eunuch guardian of the harem. Soap disputes flooded his court. Allegations of stolen bars, swapped scents, even misapplied lathering rituals became routine. One eunuch was dismissed after it was discovered he had rerouted an entire shipment of amber soap from the Valide Sultan to a lesser concubine rumored to be his patron. Soap, it turned out, was not only a cleansing agent, it was a political weapon. These quiet battles reached their peak in the mid-17th century during the reign of Sultan Ibrahim, a ruler known not for his wisdom, but for his eccentricities. Nicknamed Ibrahim the Mad by later historians, he had a particular obsession with scents and textures. It was recorded that he ordered all women in the harem to bathe in musk-scented soap for a full week before being allowed in his presence. This caused a soap shortage in Istanbul that led to black market trading among the palace staff. One telak was caught attempting to dilute musk soap with olive oil to stretch his supply. He was promptly exiled. This period also saw the rise of counterfeit soaps, bars falsely scented, wrapped to resemble high-ranking selections, and smuggled into the harem by bribed servants. To combat this, the palace established a soap verification board, an informal group of eunuchs and bath mistresses tasked with verifying soap purity before it entered the hammam. They were trained in scent identification, texture comparison, and even methods of foam consistency analysis. These soap testers became minor celebrities within the palace, often bribed, occasionally blackmailed, and always feared. And yet, for all the melodrama, the soap wars remained contained within the bounds of etiquette. Open confrontation was forbidden. Disputes were handled through layers of protocol, layers of scent, and layers of hierarchy. A stolen bar of soap could not be accused, it could only be inferred. A misused scent was never admitted, only quietly corrected by the reshuffling of attendants. To outsiders, this all seemed absurd. European visitors to the Ottoman court often misunderstood the hammam entirely. To them, it was an exotic indulgence. They marveled at the domes, the marble, the ritual washing, unaware that within the steam floated 1,000 unspoken tensions. Their records described serene bathing ceremonies, but never grasped the power dynamics concealed beneath the surface. But for those inside the palace, for the women of the harem, for the eunuchs who managed the gates, for the telaks who lathered backs with careful neutrality, soap was never just soap. It was the scent of favor, the texture of political capital, the foam of proximity to power. And as the empire changed, as modernity crept through the halls of Topkapi, the soap wars took on new meanings. Industrial soaps began to replace handmade ones. French perfumes began to mingle with Anatolian oils. The palace baths remained heated, but their politics cooled. Still, even toward the end of the empire, in the quiet chambers of the aging palace, the rituals of soap persisted. An elderly telak, trained in the old ways, once remarked, "We did not wash bodies. We washed away suspicion." And so, as you stand now in your imagination, back in that steaming marble room, with the scent of rose and musk curling through the air, consider this. In a world ruled by shadows and whispers, what speaks louder than the soap you are given? The hammam had no throne, no pulpit, no sword. Yet, within its scented steam and murmured rituals, power whispered just as loudly as it did in the Sultan's council chambers. In many ways more loudly. For unlike the grand halls of politics, where men argued with titles and decrees, the bathhouse was governed by implication. Soap, humble, scented, dissolvable, became the instrument of a more subtle kind of power. As the 18th century dawned, the Ottoman court was no longer in its prime, but it was still rich in ceremonial behavior. The imperial baths remained sacred ground, especially in the harem, where women of varying rank shared space but never status. And the quiet, never declared soap wars entered their most refined phase. It was no longer about stealing bars or switching scents that was too crude. Now it was about access, supply routes, and loyalty. Within the labyrinthine palace walls, a single shipment of high-grade soap might pass through 8 hands before reaching its final recipient. Eunuchs, scribes, guild messengers, storeroom keepers, and bath attendants all played a role in the chain, and each step presented an opportunity not necessarily for theft, but for alliance. A eunuch loyal to the Valide Sultan might mistakenly reroute a consort's shipment through slower channels. A telak loyal to a lesser wife might overlather her with fragrant musk, exceeding his instructions. A soap supplier, hopping to curry favor with a powerful patron, might include a discreet, rare bar of jasmine lemon technically unapproved by the household stewards. These were small actions, barely noticeable, but in the politics of the harem, small was strategic. The inner workings of these soap alliances were rarely written down. What we know comes from fragments, letters between guilds, whispers preserved in chroniclers' side notes, and scattered reports from disgraced eunuchs exiled from court life. One such letter, archived in the writings of the Silsila Osmani, a collection of biographies and observations, reads, "The soap destined for the lady of the second pavilion arrived already softened. The scent was weak. She believes the lady of the crimson room had her shipment delayed. I have cautioned the bath master not to intervene." In that single note lies an entire web of politics. The lady of the crimson room and the lady of the second pavilion were likely rival consorts, vying for influence, perhaps even for the Sultan's attention. Their weapons were not daggers or poison, but timing, fragrance, and the thin sheen of oil on a servant's palm. Soap preferences became signatures. To bathe in sandalwood was to be seen as conservative, rooted in tradition. Jasmine was bolder, thought to carry romantic ambition. Musk was dominant, expensive, and often reserved for elder matriarchs. Rose was delicate, ideal for those wishing to portray innocence. and ambergris, the rarest, most pungent of all, was practically a statement of war. Bath schedules were strategically arranged. High-ranking women were given the first hours of the day, when the heat was freshest and the air least clouded. Lower-ranking women came after, when the marble was slick with condensation and the steam less generous. But soap allocation didn't follow the same logic. A favored concubine might be lower on the schedule but receive the most luxurious lathering. This created tension. It wasn't just about the soap itself, it was the display. Lathering was not done in private. The Telek A-trained female bath attendant in the harem would wash her charge while others observed. A long, drawn-out scrubbing with rich, fragrant foam sent a message. This woman is beloved. She is pampered. Her scent lingers long after she leaves. Naturally, such displays bred jealousy. Some consorts reportedly brought their own soap, hidden beneath their robes, to avoid relying on court-issued rations. Others bribed attendants to accidentally spill soap over rivals' robes, forcing them to request replacements and risk being given inferior substitutes. There was even a term whispered among attendants, sabon le rezil almak, to be disgraced by soap. It referred to the moment when a woman's soap failed to lather properly, leaving her exposed in both body and status. Whether the fault of ingredients or deliberate sabotage, it mattered little. In the hammam, appearances were everything. And as always, the eunuchs were the great middlemen. The Kisler Agassi, as chief of the black eunuchs, oversaw the entire harem and thus maintained ultimate control over bath allocations. His role was complex not merely as an enforcer of rules, but as an arbitrator of subtle conflicts. Soap was rarely mentioned in his formal records, but his decisions often reflected knowledge of unspoken tensions. A eunuch might allow a favorite attendant to order soap from a preferred supplier, bypassing guild channels. Another might quietly forbid a certain scent if it became too associated with a politically sensitive figure. These were forms of soft power, invisible but deeply felt. Interestingly, there were occasional attempts to regulate soap distribution with military precision. One surviving document from the early 18th century preserved in the Ottoman archives outlines a sabon defteri, soap ledger, detailing bath schedules, scent assignments, and quantities used per session. It reads less like a record of bathing and more like a diplomatic logbook. Notes include: Wednesday, 2nd moon, 3 measures sandalwood reserved for Lady Gulbahar. No substitutions permitted. Friday, amber stock low. Reassign Lady Nurbanu to rose soap. Justification: inclement weather affecting supply routes. Do not inform the lady of the Eastern Pavilion of this change. The ledger's very existence illustrates how vital and volatile these details were. It wasn't enough to clean. One had to clean correctly. As the 18th century progressed, Istanbul's soap guilds gained influence not only for their craft, but for their access. Guild leaders who could guarantee soap to the palace, regardless of season or trade disruptions, became de facto political players. Some guild masters even negotiated their sons into court positions not as artisans, but as scribes or clerks. Soap, it seems, could open more doors than silver. But the soap wars were not only about power. They were about intimacy. In a world where women were cloistered and male courtiers moved behind lattices and walls, the hammam was one of the few spaces where social politics could be played out through touch, smell, and skin. It was where alliances were made with a glance, where rivalries simmered beneath scented foam, where hierarchy was reinforced not by decree, but by the thickness of your lather and the perfume that clung to your hair after you left. These were not grand battles. No lives were lost, but reputations countless. And in a palace where reputation meant everything, meant comfort, survival, or access to the sultan, that made these wars all the more vital. Still, a quiet question remains. In a world so obsessed with scent and soap, what happened when someone chose not to bathe at all? The hammam had rules, layers of them, like folds in a towel, soft but binding. Everyone from the sultan's mother to the lowest bath attendant was stitched into a hierarchy of scent, time, and lather. But what happens when someone steps out of that structure not with noise, but with absence? It was perhaps the most unusual tactic in the long, quiet saga of the soap wars. Not to choose a different scent, not to bribe an attendant, but to not bathe at all. The woman in question, known in the archival shorthand as Dilruba Hanum, was not a royal concubine of particular beauty or lineage. She did not have the bold confidence of a Valide sultan or the scheming prowess of a favorite. But she had one quality that set her apart in the steamy halls of the imperial baths. She refused to follow the expected rituals. At first it was barely noticed. A missed bath day not uncommon, especially during a fever. Then a second, a third. Whispers began to move through the bath attendants. She said she is clean enough. That phrase, repeated with uncertainty, stirred mild confusion. How could one be clean enough in a place where cleansing was the very point? By the time her absence was noticed by the Kisler Agassi, it had become a pattern, deliberate, defiant. Dilruba Hanum had ceased to attend her scheduled baths, not due to illness or piety or even protest. She simply preferred the privacy of her own chamber, where she claimed she washed herself with plain water and unscented soap from her family's village near Amasya. It was a violation of neither law nor decree, but it was a disruption. The baths were not only about hygiene, they were about surveillance. A woman's appearance, her scent, her choice of oils, all of these offered cues to her standing. When Dilruba removed herself from that arena, she removed herself from evaluation, from comparison, from power. This was radical. There was no formal punishment for her choice, but the effects were immediate. Invitations from other women slowed. A few key telaks began avoiding her name on the rotation. Her robes were no longer pressed as crisply. Her food, though still delivered, lacked the subtle enhancements reserved for favorites. The absence of soap had created a kind of social stink, not of the body, but of ambiguity. Was she rejecting the hierarchy? Was she trying to shame the others? Was she mocking the system? Dilruba never said. What we do know comes from a strange collection of observations, part harem gossip, part bureaucratic annoyance compiled in the margins of the harem records of the early 19th century. One steward wrote, Dilruba Hanum continues to avoid the communal bath. No complaint has been registered. She claims no insult, but the other ladies are disquieted by her scentlessness. That word scentlessness captures the core of the unease. In the Ottoman harem, to have no scent was akin to having no rank. Fragrance was how you announced yourself without words. It lingered behind you, marking your presence even after your body had left a room. For Dilruba to erase that entirely was not a neutral act. It was a philosophical one. And she was not alone for long. In the years that followed, a few others quietly, cautiously adopted similar habits, not out of loyalty to Dilruba, but out of fatigue. The rituals, the expense, the posturing, it wore down even the most politically astute. A low-ranking concubine named Hava reportedly began alternating her attendance, citing headaches from the strong musk scents. Another, Aish, claimed that the marble in the hammam made her knees ache, and requested a simple basin in her chamber instead. To be clear, these women were not revolutionaries. They were not campaigning against the institution, but their quiet decisions added up. And the eunuchs noticed. In 1826, a new internal policy was drafted by the Harem Stewardship Office titled Regulations on the Orderly Bathing of Imperial Women. It stated that attendance at scheduled baths shall be mandatory unless excused by direct medical advisement or the explicit will of the Valide Sultan. The rule was paper armor stiff and symbolic. Enforcement remained light. The shift was already happening. Outside the palace, soap was changing too. European influence, especially French perfumes and industrial soaps, was flooding the Istanbul market. Where Ottoman soaps had been thick, oily, and deeply scented, the new imports were sharper, lighter, factory-wrapped, and most importantly mass-produced. The uniqueness of courtly soap began to vanish. Once, a woman's soap was a mark of custom-made luxury. Now, it came in boxes stamped with foreign crests and labeled in French. And with this shift came a more profound unraveling. The soap wars, as subtle and silent as they had always been, lost their footing. By the mid-19th century, under the reign of Sultan Abdülmecid, Topkapi Palace itself began to fade in importance. The Sultan moved to the newly built Dolmabahce Palace, more European in design, with chandeliers, long mirrored corridors, and bathrooms that mimicked those in Parisian estates. The hammam, once the emotional center of the harem's political web, became a symbol of the old way, beautiful, ceremonial, and increasingly unused. And Dilruba Hanım. Her story ends not with exile, nor with scandal, but with silence. She remained in the harem, never punished, never promoted. She had no children with the Sultan, no recorded audience with the Valide. She lived, washed as she chose, and when the time came died quietly, buried under a simple headstone in a cemetery for palace women. But her legacy lingered in the small acts of refusal that followed her. Not loud enough to topple thrones, just quiet enough to unsettle the waters of custom. The soap wars had always been about more than scent. They were about access and appearance and the fragile mechanics of rank. When scent ceased to signify, the game changed. And when the game changed, the old tools of influence, lather, foam, fragrance, lost their grip. Still today, when you walk through the silent halls of the Topkapi harem, you may smell nothing. No rose, no musk, no soap. But pause long enough, and you might still feel the weight of those quiet rebellions. The ghost of jasmine, the whisper of olive oil, and the memory of a woman who bathed in her own time. So ask yourself, in a world where power is perfumed and status is scented, is the truest freedom simply to smell like nothing at all? Story 3. Feeding the Birds, the Empire's Strange Compassion Laws. You might imagine that in a vast empire stretching across 3 continents, managing armies, taxation, and international treaties, birds would be among the least of concerns. And yet for centuries, the Ottoman Empire wrote laws, set aside funds, hired officials, and composed poetry, all for the welfare of birds. To modern ears, it might sound romantic, even quaint, but in the Ottoman worldview, the relationship between humans and animals was not merely symbolic. It was structured, codified, and in the case of birds, bureaucratized. This was not an empire that treated animals as background decoration. This was an empire that fed sparrows with state budgets. The roots of this attitude trace back to a concept deeply embedded in Islamic and Ottoman thought, merhamet, mercy or compassion. But merhamet was not abstract. It demanded action. Feeding the poor, aiding the sick, and crucially, caring for animals, even those that provided no clear benefit to humans, was considered not just pious, but necessary. And so the birds of Istanbul and other major Ottoman cities lived lives of surprising privilege. If you walked through the city in the 17th or 18th century, you would not simply see birds, you would see the empire seeing them. You would notice small wooden birdhouses, elaborate, carved, and sometimes palatial, affixed to the sides of mosques, madrasas, and even public fountains. These were called kershkleri, bird pavilions. More than decoration, they were acts of compassion. Some were no bigger than your palm, others were nearly a meter wide, complete with miniature arched windows and carved balconies. Some even had names, passed down like minor architectural legends. Architectural historians have identified dozens of these structures throughout Istanbul and Edirne. They weren't made by accident. Skilled artisans carved them into stone facades or built them into wooden beams during construction. Mosques like Yeni Kami and Ayub Sultan still bear their tiny, elegant outlines like dollhouses tucked into marble. But birds weren't just housed, they were fed, and that's where the bureaucracy stepped in. Ottoman charitable foundations, called vakifs, were established to support everything from public kitchens to schools. Some were extremely specific, and several we know from archived foundation records were created exclusively for feeding birds. One vakif, endowed by a wealthy merchant's widow in the late 18th century, allocated part of her estate to be used for the procurement of barley and millet to be scattered on the mosque roofs for the comfort of the winged ones. Another, from the coastal town of Iznik, paid a small stipend to a man who walked the streets at dawn and dusk, casting seed along ledges, courtyards, and fountains. His title, the Kush Bakasisi, literally bird carer. He was not a zookeeper. He was not part of the janissaries or the court, but he held a position of cultural respect. He performed an act of quiet state mercy in public for creatures that would never say thank you. And that perhaps was the point. Ottoman literature of the period reflects this ethos. Poets often compared the just ruler to a well-fed sparrow, small, agile, and cared for. The flock, in these metaphors, was the people. The sultan was to protect and nourish them not because he expected loyalty, but because it was his duty under God. Even in imperial ceremonies, birds played symbolic roles. White doves were released at weddings, funerals, and holidays not merely for spectacle, but as a way of visually expressing peace, purity, or divine presence. But unlike in the West, where such symbolism often ended at the event's edge, in the Ottoman world, the birds continued to be fed long after the crowd dispersed. The act of feeding became a routine civic gesture. Elderly women in Istanbul were often seen throwing crumbs onto mosque steps, whispering prayers as pigeons fluttered down. Children were taught to scatter seed, especially on Fridays and during religious festivals. And it wasn't only the public. Palace attendants also followed rules of mercy, scattering feed near the kitchens, avoiding nests, and ensuring that no birds were disturbed without reason. In one recorded incident from the late 1600s, a palace servant was reportedly reprimanded not for neglecting his duties, but for disturbing a pair of nesting swallows near the imperial bakery. The birds, it was said, had nested in the same nook for 3 years. Moving them, even accidentally, was considered deeply disrespectful. But perhaps the most astonishing feature of this avian affection was not in its sentiment, but in its regulation. The empire kept records of bird care, not in every city and not with the detail given to taxation or land grants, but enough to show intent. Municipal archives from Bursa, for instance, contain ledgers of grain expenditures including amounts designated for fowl, stray, and small. In some cities, birdseed was purchased in bulk and stored in covered barrels near mosques and caravanserais. There was even an informal schedule. At certain mosques, attendants would scatter grain after the second prayer of the day. In colder months, more grain was offered. During droughts, shallow basins were filled for drinking. This wasn't a whim, it was a patterned, institutionalized act of care. So why all this attention? Certainly, religious mercy played a role, but there was also a practical, even ecological, wisdom to it. Birds kept insects at bay. They scavenged refuse. They were part of the city's delicate ecosystem. Feeding them ensured their presence and their service. It was an early form of urban environmental management, masked in moral obligation. And yet, even this quiet tradition saw its share of politics. Feeding birds was considered good, but who paid for it was another matter. Occasionally, mosque caretakers complained that birdseed costs were rising. Wealthier patrons, those whose vakifs were expected to sustain such efforts, sometimes tried to redirect funds. Petitions were filed. Arguments were made. In one instance, a cleric at a prominent mosque objected to excessive feeding of idle pigeons. claiming the funds would be better spent on books. The case was reviewed by the local cadi, a judge. His verdict: let the birds eat. Books could wait. Today, if you walk through the courtyards of old Ottoman cities in Istanbul, Bursa, or even in smaller towns like Safranbolu, you'll still see birds nesting in carved niches and crevices. Some are original, others have been restored, and beneath them, now and then, you may spot a scattering of seed, placed not by a clerk or appointed carer, but by an old habit passed from one hand to another. So when you consider empire, do not think only of armies and edicts. Think also of millet grain and sloping rooftops. Think of a government that weighed the comfort of birds in its moral calculus. And ask yourself, what kind of civilization builds houses for birds it does not own, and feeds creatures that may never return? Compassion, when systematized, often takes on a peculiar shape. In the Ottoman Empire, the decision to feed birds was not merely an act of kindness, it became a matter of paperwork. Mercy was folded into scrolls, stamped with seals, and logged into ledgers. And in this quiet bureaucracy of feathers, the birds became both recipients of care and symbols of order. The vakif system, through which charitable foundations operated, formed the backbone of Ottoman civic and religious life. While many of these endowments supported water fountains, soup kitchens, or Quran recitation halls, a surprising number were earmarked for non-human beneficiaries, especially birds. One such document, dated 1743 and preserved in the Ottoman archives under the Ceremonies Vakif collection, reads: let 4 handfuls of millet grain be scattered daily upon the roof tiles of the Mosque of Light, Nur Kamiyai, so that the birds may find rest and sustenance, and the prayers of their fluttering wings may bless the name of the founder, Ahmed Effendi, son of Hassan the bookbinder. This document, poetic in its legalism, outlines not only the grain allowance but the time of day it was to be distributed, after akindi, the afternoon prayer, the location, the southeast corner of the roof, where sun and warmth lingered, and even the person responsible, a steward named Yavuz, whose task was to climb a narrow staircase once each day with a burlap sack of seed. This was no mere side duty. In many vakifs, the role of Kushlara Bakan, the bird overseer, came with a modest salary and sometimes even living quarters adjacent to the mosque. He was expected to guard the food from rodents, distribute it evenly, and ensure no one tampered with the process. A yearly inspection by mosque trustees confirmed his honesty. This arrangement may seem exaggerated, even whimsical, but it speaks to the Ottoman view that mercy was not effective unless it was structured. To feed a bird was noble. To ensure a bird was fed every day without fail was divine administration. Of course, not all birds were equal. Pigeons, doves, and sparrows, the city dwellers, received the bulk of attention. Their flocks were easy to reach and frequently visible. Doves were associated with peace, pigeons with humility. Their soft cooing was thought to echo the recitation of prayer. Owls and crows, by contrast, were less welcome. Associated with bad omens, they were often driven away or simply ignored in these compassionate plans. Still, even those birds found refuge in some corners. A particularly eccentric vakif in Edirne, established by a former vizier named Ali Pasha in 1691, designated funds not only for beloved birds of dawn, but for those sorrowful flyers of night, referring almost certainly to owls. Ali Pasha's record, full of careful calligraphy, included this cryptic line: to provide warmth for the unseen ones, whose wings whisper through the minarets when others sleep. His bequest included not just feed, but rooftop shelters insulated with scraps of wool to protect against the chill of Thracian winters. Some historians speculate he had grown fond of a specific owl family nesting in his garden. Others suggest he was simply fond of oddities. These arrangements raise questions about the motivations behind such care. Was this truly altruism, a pious duty, a superstition? The answer, as often happens in history, is yes, and for many Ottomans, bird feeding was an act of religious merit. Islamic traditions emphasize compassion toward all of God's creatures. One widely cited hadith, a recorded saying of the Prophet Muhammad, tells of a woman who was condemned for starving a cat, and another who was forgiven her sins for giving water to a thirsty dog. The principle was clear: kindness to animals could tip the scales of judgment. This belief filtered into daily behavior. Feeding birds wasn't only good, it was safeguarding the soul. It also reinforced civic order. Those who established or maintained bird-feeding vakifs became benefactors of the city. A wealthy merchant who might not be welcome in scholarly circles could find a new reputation through a public act of avian charity. A scribe, lacking sons to carry his name, might instead fund a bird shelter on the facade of a madrasa, his name carved in marble, kept alive by cooing residents. Even in death this mattered. Gravestones of the period sometimes note charitable deeds: builder of the fountain, feeder of the orphans, and not uncommonly, lover of the birds. This final phrase was more than poetic, it served as a kind of posthumous appeal, a quiet declaration that the deceased had shown merhamet in life, and was therefore worthy of rahmat, divine mercy, in death. But feeding birds was not always a quiet matter. Occasionally, disputes arose. A famous case from late 18th century Bursa involved a guild of bakers accused of stealing birdseed grain during a grain shortage. The millet, which had been purchased using vakif funds for rooftop feeding, was allegedly mixed with flour to offset rising costs. The theft was discovered when local Kush Bakasalari noticed that the usual seed delivery barrels were empty. A trial followed. Witnesses were called. The birds, of course, could not testify. The Cadi, after reviewing the vakif documents, ruled against the bakers. They were fined, forced to repay the stolen grain, and ordered to personally scatter seed from the roof of the city mosque each day for a full month, a public act of penance. Such stories reveal how compassion, when codified, becomes a framework not only for charity but for accountability. The Ottomans did not simply say, "Be kind." They asked to whom, how often, with what, and who will be responsible if you are not. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this bird-centered bureaucracy is how unremarkable it seemed to those within it. There are few surviving records that express surprise or novelty at these practices. They appear in tax logs, court records, and architectural surveys without fanfare. To the Ottomans, it was natural. Why wouldn't a city make space for birds? Why shouldn't a mosque provide food for the sky's smallest worshippers? It was all part of a larger vision, one in which society was not a ladder, but a circle of obligations, stretching outward from humans to animals, to the wind, to the rain. In this worldview, kindness to birds was not charity, it was maintenance. Still, not everyone complied. Some landlords, resenting the droppings or the noise, removed Kush kershkleri from their buildings. Others bricked up the niches or painted over them. Urban reformers in the Tanzimat era, especially in the 19th century, began to question the logic of maintaining animal care in an age of steamships, cannons, and clocks. Birdseed, they argued, was for poets, not progress. And yet the birds stayed. In Istanbul, pigeons still gather in great clouds outside the Yeni Cami, where elderly men scatter seed not from obligation, but from memory. Some may not even know why the practice persists. It is simply what one does. The birdhouses remain, to some crumbling, some lovingly restored. A ledge, a crevice, a carved balcony for birds no longer tracked in ledgers, but still remembered in stone. And perhaps this leads to the quietest question of all. If we once made laws to feed the smallest among us, and carved mansions into marble just to shelter a dove, then what exactly have we forgotten? In the name of progress, The empire that once fed birds with budgeted millet and measured mercy did not fall in a storm. It unraveled quietly like a carpet rolled in upon itself, its fibers pulled loose thread by thread. But even as the Ottoman Empire faded from political maps, its quieter habits like feeding birds left imprints not so easily erased. In the 19th century, the Ottoman world tilted toward modernity. Steamships plied the Bosphorus. Gas lamps replaced candles. The telegraph wires buzzed with coded messages, far more urgent than the flutter of wings on a mosque ledge. And so, too, the vakifs for birds began to wane. Some dissolved under financial pressure. Others were absorbed into more generalized charity funds. A few disappeared without explanation, their grain stores emptied, their bird-feeding stewards dismissed. The ledgers once meticulously kept thin to a few final entries, like the last coals in a long-burning brazier. One such entry, from 1878, in a vakif ledger associated with the Hasai Ali Pasha Mosque in Üsküdar, reads, "Due to scarcity of funds and the passing of the steward, bird feed shall no longer be purchased until further notice. May the birds remember better times." That line, part elegy, part accounting note, marks not just an economic decision, but a cultural turning point. The birds, of course, remained, they always do. But the Ottoman view of them not as pests or symbols, but as dependents began to feel out of place in an empire struggling to define itself amid European pressure, territorial loss, and internal reform. The Tanzimat reforms of the mid-19th century, while focused on modernization, carried with them a subtle shift in moral logic, efficiency over emotion, function over form. Feeding birds simply didn't fit. In some quarters, the Kush-Kershkleri were removed from buildings during restoration. Viewed as unnecessary embellishments, they were sometimes replaced by smooth stone or plastered facades. New constructions in Galata and Pira, heavily influenced by European architecture, lacked the intricate carvings of older Ottoman neighborhoods. Windows, balconies, facades all turned inward, more focused on human comfort than animal refuge. Yet not all was forgotten. In some mosques and madrasas, particularly in Istanbul's older quarters, a quiet form of resistance took root. Elderly caretakers, long past the age of state employment, continued to scatter seeds, not because they were paid, but because they remembered when others were. In neighborhoods like Fatih and Ayub, small wooden boxes reappeared beneath windows, nailed in secret by locals who could not bear the sight of bare ledges. Birds, after all, are not easily exiled. They continued to nest, sometimes defiantly, in drain pipes and cupolas. They claimed abandoned Kush-Kershkleri as their own, ignoring the humans who had forgotten them. And those who looked up really looked began to ask questions. In the early 20th century, as the Ottoman Empire collapsed under the weight of war and political revolution, Turkish national identity surged forward, bright, secular, and future-bound. Mustafa Kemal Atatürk led reforms that swept away many Ottoman traditions, both practical and symbolic. The fez was banned, the Arabic script was replaced, and the very idea of the vakif was restructured under the new Directorate of Religious Foundations. Few thought to ask what happened to the birdhouses. But not everyone was ready to let go. In 1925, a short article appeared in a Turkish-language newspaper, penned by a civil servant in Istanbul's vakif office. It was titled "The Forgotten Ledges." The article, barely more than a column, described a small wooden birdhouse falling into disrepair on the side of a mosque in Beşiktaş. The writer, unnamed, ended with the line, "Once we built houses for those who needed nothing from us but a safe place to rest. Perhaps our strength lay not in our armies, but in the grain we gave away." It was not a call to restore the empire. It was a quiet remembrance of values too gentle for bureaucracy, too patient for politics. In the decades that followed, Istanbul modernized. New buildings rose. Highways split old neighborhoods. Commerce replaced contemplation, but the birds did not leave. They adjusted as they always had. Today, if you walk through Istanbul's winding alleys, particularly near Süleymaniye Mosque, or in the shadow of the Blue Mosque, you may still see them. The tiny pavilions, often chipped or faded, clinging to stone like memories. A few have been restored, thanks to renewed interest in Ottoman architectural heritage. Modern conservationists now catalog Kuşkuşları as cultural assets. Tour guides point them out with reverence, their voices lowering as they explain their function. But to most passers-by, they are curiosities. What is perhaps most moving is that some of the ethic has survived, even when the system did not. Elderly Istanbulites still scatter birdseed in the squares outside mosques. Vendors sell paper cones of millet not far from where Kuşbakıcıları once walked. And children, some of whom may never have heard of the Vakifs or the old imperial duties, laugh as pigeons swarm at their feet, unaware that they are participating in a centuries-old ritual of mercy. The old saying goes, "He who feeds the birds feeds the soul." And that, perhaps, is the quietest legacy of the Ottoman Empire, not its sultans or sieges, but its insistence that even the smallest lives are worthy of care. That a sparrow, unseen and unnamed, should have a roof to nest under, a ledge to rest on, and a handful of seed waiting at dawn. So what remains then when empires fall? Sometimes only the wind through stone arches, the flutter of wings above a broken minaret, and the memory of a law that once said, "Let the birds eat first." Story 4. The Janissary Coffee Riots. It began with coffee. Not politics, not pay, not religion or reform. Just coffee, bitter, black, simmered over coals and poured in small cups. But in the Ottoman Empire, coffee was never just coffee. By the 17th century, coffee had become an essential part of life in Istanbul. Merchants drank it in the smoky stillness of early morning. Poets sipped it in back-alley cafes while composing verses by candlelight. Officials conducted slow discussions over tiny porcelain cups. Even religious scholars debated its effects on the soul. Was it merely stimulating or dangerously indulgent? But for one particular group, the Janissaries, the elite infantry corps of the Ottoman army, coffee was more than custom. It was culture, privilege, and ultimately a cause for revolt. To understand how such a drink could fuel a mutiny, one must first understand the Janissaries themselves. Formed in the late 14th century, the Janissary Corps, Yenisari Akagi, was originally made up of young Christian boys taken through the Devshirme system, the blood tax converted to Islam, and trained as professional soldiers. Over time, they became one of the most powerful military institutions in the empire, disciplined, loyal, and feared. But by the 1600s, things had changed. The Corps had grown bloated, corrupt, and increasingly entangled in urban life. Many Janissaries now held shops, ran businesses, and lived more like guildsmen than soldiers. They had families, houses, political opinions. And they had coffee. The Janissary barracks, especially those in Istanbul, maintained coffee kitchens, separate from their main dining areas. These kitchens were not just for nourishment. They were places of gossip, planning, rest, and silent rebellion. Over time, the preparation and serving of coffee became ritualized. Each kettle had its proper custodian. Each ember was monitored. Each cup, passed hand to hand, became a silent signal of camaraderie and sometimes sedition. By the mid-17th century, the Ottoman court had begun to worry about coffee houses. Sultan Murad IV had famously banned them in the 1630s, believing they encouraged idleness, dissent, and plotting. His bans were enforced with a severity that bordered on legend: spies in disguise, swift beheadings, coffee drinkers flogged in public. But the bans didn't last. After Murad's death, the cafes reopened, and coffee flowed again, including in the Janissary compounds. Yet the memory of repression lingered. So when whispers began that new restrictions were being considered, higher taxes on coffee imports, limits on public consumption, even discussions of shutting down coffee houses. Near the barracks, the Janissaries responded in the only way they knew how. They prepared for revolt. It was not immediate. First they complained. Then they refused to serve on certain patrols. Then the kettles stopped boiling. A chronicler from the period, Ibrahim Pasevi, recorded an incident where an entire company of Janissaries stood idle, refusing orders, until the kettles were restored and the coffee warmed. At first, this seemed like petty insubordination, but it was more than that. In the Janissary hierarchy, the kettle, Kazgan, symbolized unity and discipline. Each battalion had its own cauldron, not just for food, but as an emblem of collective strength. To overturn or extinguish the kettle was to signal mutiny. And now, the Janissaries had added coffee to that symbol. A disrupted coffee service was no longer just inconvenience. It was an insult, a provocation, a declaration. In 1656, under the reign of Sultan Mehmed IV, tensions boiled over. The palace had implemented a set of reforms aimed at curbing Janissary influence. Among them, a minor edict regulating the hours of coffeehouse operation near the barracks. The order was bureaucratic, dull, barely publicized, but the Janissaries took notice. Within days, rumors spread that the government intended to confiscate the kettles. Whether or not this was true hardly mattered. The symbolism was unmistakable. The following morning, the gates of the Aga Kapisi, the barracks of the Janissary commander, were found shut. No fires were lit. No drills were held. The smell of coffee, usually wafting from the kitchens at dawn, was gone. It was not the absence of coffee that terrified the city. It was the silence. Within hours, smoke rose from other corners of the city, not from cafe chimneys, but from burning ledgers. Janissaries set fire to tax records, vandalized coffee inspectors' offices, and stormed shops believed to be collaborating with court officials. Cafe owners were forced to declare loyalty to the core. Those who hesitated found their premises smashed. The Grand Vizier at the time, Kurpulu Mehmed Pasha, a hardliner known for his unyielding governance, ordered troops to restore order. But he underestimated the scope of the rebellion. The Janissaries were not hiding. They marched, kettle in hand, down Divan Yalu, chanting slogans and demanding the rescinding of the edicts. And they drank coffee while doing it. Contemporary accounts describe lines of soldiers sitting cross-legged in the middle of the avenue, sipping from shared cups as they blocked movement. This was not merely defiance. It was pageantry, a staged reminder that their strength, like their brew, could not be diluted. The palace, recognizing the danger, made swift concessions. The edicts were withdrawn, officials were dismissed, and the kettle, which had not been lit for 3 days, was rekindled with great ceremony in the Janissary courtyard, accompanied by music and cheers. But something had changed. The Janissaries had used coffee not only as a metaphor, but as a mechanism, a tool to organize, to resist, to assert identity. And the court, forced into retreat, realized that even the smallest rituals could carry revolutionary weight. In the months that followed, coffee discipline became a common phrase in political discussions. Spies were sent to cafes. Baristas, often Janissary retirees, were watched for seditious whispers. The beverage itself was never banned again, but its power was acknowledged begrudgingly by the state. All over a bitter drink. So how did a few spoons of ground beans and a shared kettle become a symbol of armed protest? Why did the Janissaries guard their coffee so fiercely? And what does it mean for an empire when even a cup of coffee becomes a line you do not cross? After the fires were put out and the kettles rekindled, there was no formal inquiry, no tribunal, no arrests. The 1656 coffee disturbance, what some later chroniclers dubbed the Janissary Coffee Riot, passed into history as just another episode in the long, simmering struggle between palace and barracks. But for those who lived through it, particularly in the tea houses and tiled courtyards of Istanbul, things had changed. Coffee had become political infrastructure. The Janissary Corps, already known for its defiance and meddling in state affairs, now had a new tool. One that didn't wear a uniform, didn't carry a sword, and didn't need to march in formation. The coffee house. Across the Ottoman capital and in provincial cities like Edirne, Bursa, and Damascus, Janissary-affiliated cafes became semi-official hubs of communication and power. These were not lavish establishments. Many were no more than dimly lit rooms with a few stools, a battered Sèvres coffee pot, and a brazier glowing in the corner. But they were filled with regulars, men who wore Janissary insignia, or who had family in the Corps, or who simply aligned themselves with its worldview. Anti-reform, skeptical of palace interference, and fiercely protective of their collective privileges. The Ottoman state knew this, of course, and yet it hesitated to act. Why? Because coffee houses were now so entrenched in urban life that to crack down on them risked alienating not just soldiers, but civilians, merchants, scribes, craftsmen, all of whom used cafes as social forums, business venues, even places of informal arbitration. So instead, the palace watched. In the years after the 1656 disturbances, a series of official reports were compiled under the direction of the Shaykhul Islam, chief religious authority, and the Istanbul Qadisi, chief judge of the city. These documents, known collectively as the Kahvehain Defterleri or coffeehouse registers, listed known establishments, their proprietors, and any suspicious affiliations. Some cafes were noted as harmless, others carried coded labels. Mutfak Akakli, kitchen affiliated, referring to Janissary kitchens. Beklin and Akagi, waiting hearth, indicating that members of the Corps gathered there off-duty. And the most concerning, Kazgin Alti, beneath the kettle, believed to refer to covert organizing spaces. The symbolism of the kettle, the Janissary cauldron, continued to loom large. In Janissary culture, the kettle was everything. The heart of the battalion, the banner of loyalty, the sign of unity. When the kettle was lit, duties resumed. When it was overturned, it was mutiny. Some battalions had ornate kettles mounted on poles, paraded during ceremonial occasions. And in the cafes, a miniature version of this symbol began to appear. Small copper kettles, often blackened from years of use, were set on central braziers not merely for brewing, but for visual reference. To light one was to signal that conversation had begun. To let it go cold was to show displeasure with the gathering. Cafe owners became known as kettle men, and their loyalties were quietly tracked. This practice reached a curious height during the reign of Sultan Ahmed III, 1703–1730, a period marked by flourishing arts, intense political tension, and the rise of what would later be called the Tulip Era. Amid festivals and architectural splendor, Janissary influence continued to grow not just on the battlefield, but in the back rooms of Istanbul's coffee houses. According to a surviving Tahrir Defteri tax record from 1721, over 1,200 licensed coffee houses operated in Istanbul alone. Many more functioned unofficially. Of these, a significant number were located near Janissary lodges, odalar, or barracks. Even cafes in distant neighborhoods bore names like Yenisari Akagi or Kazansai Kavisi, linking them by reputation to the Corps. But what truly worried the state was not the volume, it was the network. Coffee houses, unlike mosques or military lodges, had no official oversight structure. They were informal, mutable, and run by civilians. Messages passed easily. Ideas flowed. Slogans were whispered between cups. And the Janissaries, who increasingly saw themselves as both warriors and watchmen of tradition, used this flow to shape popular opinion. Rumors started in cafes, and in a city where rumor often preceded revolt, this was dangerous. Consider the events of 1703, the Edirne Incident, or Edirne Vakasi. Sultan Mustafa II had relocated his court to Edirne, avoiding the pressures of Istanbul. The Janissaries, frustrated by distance, poor wages, and court favoritism, began gathering in coffeehouses, particularly those near the Yeni Cami and Suleymani Mosque. It was here that the slogans began. The Sultan has abandoned the city. He feeds the favorites and forgets the soldiers. Let the kettle be overturned. Within weeks, these whispers became chants. And then a march. And then a full-blown uprising. The Janissaries returned to Istanbul, rallied the ulama, religious scholars, stormed the Topkapi Palace, and forced the Sultan's abdication. All organized at least in part over cups of coffee. This was not mere symbolism, it was logistics. Coffee houses had become the printing presses of revolt, the bulletin boards of dissent. Without needing to write a single word, the Janissaries could broadcast their discontent. Of course, the Ottoman state tried to adapt. By the late 18th century, new regulations emerged. Cafe owners were required to register with the local imam or neighborhood agha. The size of gatherings was limited. Games like tavla, backgammon were permitted, but only during daylight. Certain cafes were forbidden from serving after evening prayers. These were not random controls, they were targeted efforts to disrupt momentum. Still, the cafes endured. In fact, they multiplied. By the early 1800s, Istanbul's poorer districts saw a rise in Janissary-themed establishments. Some were decorated with military memorabilia. Others claimed to serve traditional kettle-roasted beans, linking their brand to Janissary values of strength, loyalty, and anti-corruption. This fusion of coffee, culture, and military nostalgia created a kind of emotional infrastructure. One didn't need to be a Janissary to drink in these places, one only had to believe. And so, when Sultan Mahmud II finally moved to dismantle the Janissary Corps in 1826, a purge known as the auspicious incident Vakı-i-Hariri, he didn't just shut down the barracks. He sent soldiers to coffee houses. According to court records, over 500 establishments were raided or closed. Dozens of cafe owners were arrested. Copper kettles were seized and melted down. In some quarters, old signs bearing Janissary symbols were painted over, replaced by nondescript shop names like Se Akagi, Tea Corner. Tea, not coffee, became the new state-favored drink. It was milder, cheaper, easier to control. The kettle of revolution had been extinguished. But it was never forgotten. So what does it mean when a cup becomes a cause? When a drink passed hand to hand brews more than warmth? And when the steam fades and the kettle cools? Does the silence mean peace? Or merely the pause before another pour? They called it Vakı-i-Hariri, the auspicious incident. To the state, it was a triumph of order. To the palace scribes, it was the restoration of royal authority. But to the Janissaries, those who survived it, was the extinguishing of a fire they had kept burning for nearly 500 years. And among the embers, somewhere between the raised barracks and the silenced marches, a quieter loss brewed, the disappearance of the Janissary coffee house. It did not happen all at once. In June 1826, Sultan Mahmud II gave the order to dismantle the Janissary Corps after years of rising defiance and open disobedience. The Janissaries revolted in response as they had done so many times before, but this time, the palace was prepared. The Grand Vizier, with the support of artillery units and loyal troops, shelled the barracks. The fires that followed consumed not just the buildings but the institution. Thousands were killed, imprisoned, or exiled. The Janissary registers, including names, ranks, and pensions, were burned. And with them went the cafes. In the days and weeks after the purge, Mahmud II's men swept through Istanbul with precision. They were not simply looking for soldiers. They were searching for symbols, emblems of the old order: copper kettles, janissary banners, lodge plaques. Anything that bore the insignia of the corps was seized, destroyed, or publicly melted. In the Tadakale and Unkapanı districts, where many janissary-aligned cafes had clustered, the streets were suddenly quiet. Coffee still brewed, it never stopped, but the way it was drunk changed. Gone were the kettles mounted proudly behind the counter. Gone were the chants, the coded toasts, the slogans passed through cups. Gone was the soft rebellion that simmered just beneath the surface. The coffee house, once a haven of defiant ritual, was reduced to something tamer, functional, disposable. To avoid suspicion, some cafe owners began replacing their sezvs, the long-handled copper pots used to make Turkish coffee, with ceramic ones. A small detail, but one that signaled submission. Others redecorated entirely. New signs, new furniture, new clientele. A few tried to hold on. A narrow cafe near the Valens Aqueduct, known locally as Kazansai Mehmetin Yuri, was among the last openly janissary-aligned establishments. Its owner, Mehmet Aga, was a retired sekban and auxiliary soldier with close ties to the corps. He kept his copper kettle polished, despite warnings. He still served coffee in the same chipped cups he'd used for decades. In late July of 1826, soldiers arrived at dawn. The kettle was taken. Mehmet Aga was not arrested, but the cafe was shut. The next day, a tea vendor opened in its place. And so, quietly, the janissary coffee house passed into memory. But something lingered. Even stripped of its revolutionary edge, the Ottoman cafe retained the social architecture the janissaries had built into it. The low stools, the slow service, the deliberate ritual of sipping not to quench thirst, but to mark time. Throughout the 19th century, as Istanbul modernized and Western cafes made their appearance in Galata and Pira, the old Kavahane model endured in the backstreets of Üsküdar, Fatih, and Ayıp. These were no longer hotbeds of rebellion, they had become neighborhood anchors, where men played tavla, discussed politics in hushed tones, and debated the day's news. But the janissary element, though removed in name, had imprinted itself permanently. Even today, in the way Turkish coffee is served slowly, with care, in small cups without sugar unless requested, you can detect the echo of an older time. The discipline, the patience, the reverence. It is not loud, it is not revolutionary, but it is present. And this, perhaps, is the most Ottoman of legacies, a soft endurance, where rebellion becomes ritual, where defiance becomes flavor, where even the fall of a corps becomes a memory steeped in grounds. Some modern scholars suggest that the Janissary Café was the proto-political club of the Ottoman world, that its mixture of military influence, public visibility, and urban connection made it an early model of organized dissent centuries before political parties were legally permitted. There is some truth to this. But the Janissaries did not see themselves as revolutionaries. They saw themselves as preservers of tradition, of religion, of their privileges, yes, but also of a certain Ottoman order that resisted the flood of Western-style reforms. In that sense, the coffee house was not just a shelter. It was a vessel both for the drink and the ideals it contained. Even after the Janissaries were gone, even after their name was outlawed and their symbols erased, a version of them lived on every time someone refused to rush, insisted on real grounds, stirred the sugar separately, or drank in silence. Today, if you enter an old-style Turkish coffee house in the quiet hours of early morning, before the tourists arrive, you may still find an old man hunched over a cup, the steam curling slowly into the air. He may not know the name of the commander, whose kettle once boiled in rebellion. He may never have heard of Kazansai Mehmet or the cafe registers. But he stirs his cup with the same deliberate motion. He watches, he listens, and the silence between sips still speaks. So ask yourself, when an empire collapses, what survives? The flags, the buildings, the names? Or is it something quieter? Something passed in cups, brewed slowly, and remembered not by historians, but by habit. Story 5, Counting the Tulips, the bureaucracy of beauty. In most empires, you could measure power in fortresses, horses, ships, or silver. In the Ottoman Empire, particularly in the first half of the 18th century, you could also measure it in tulips. Not fields of tulips, not vases, not even the blooms themselves, but their inventory, their count. The Ottomans, famed for their architectural grace, culinary rituals, and military conquests, had another side, a softer, slower obsession: the cultivation, classification, and celebration of tulips. It is from this period that historians borrow the name L'Œil d'Ivry, the tulip era, a time of peace, pleasure, and administrative floristry. It was a period where the color of a flower could determine the future of a bureaucrat, where government clerks scribbled names like Night Whisper, Glass Flame, or Purple of the Prophet's Hour into official ledgers, and where forgetting to log a bloom correctly could lead to dismissal. This is the story of a flower so beloved, the empire gave it a paper trail. It began as many Ottoman customs did in gardens. The early sultans had always enjoyed nature. Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, was known to have a soft spot for roses and pomegranate trees. But it was not until the 17th and early 18th centuries, particularly during the reign of Sultan Ahmed III, 1703–1730, that tulips became more than pastime. They became a philosophy. The Sultan's Grand Vizier, Nevshehili Damat Ibrahim Pasha, was the architect of this obsession. A man more comfortable in silk-lined gardens than in smoky council chambers, he believed that the empire needed a breath, a pause after centuries of war. Under his leadership, peace treaties were signed, fountains built, and gardens expanded. Among those gardens were the Hasbasılar, the imperial flower grounds, which were located in and around Istanbul, often along the banks of the Bosphorus. And in these gardens, tulips reigned. Not just any tulips. These were not random blooms dug from the earth and admired for a moment. These were named, recorded, mapped, and taxonomized with obsessive precision, their lineage traced, their scent described, their lifespan noted. To manage all this, the court created a new bureaucratic position, the L'Œil Katibi, the tulip clerk. The tulip clerk's job was not metaphorical. He was responsible for the documentation of each variety owned or cultivated by the court. He maintained an official tulip ledger, the L'Œil d'Ivry, in which each flower was listed by name, often poetic or symbolic, color description, blooming season, garden location, no mutations or crossbreeds, patron or official who introduced it, date of first bloom, status, thriving, withered, or retired. And just as a general was judged by the number of troops under his command, or a vizier by the laws he enacted, the tulip clerk was judged by the accuracy and elegance of his floral accounting. A well-kept ledger was considered a work of art. An imprecise one was a disgrace. One surviving example of a L'Œil d'Ivry, dated 1726 and preserved in the Topkapi Palace archives, contains over 1,300 entries. Each tulip is given a distinct name. A few examples: Sheboa Glamasi, Evening Stocks Tear; Sumbul Kizili, Hyacinth Crimson; Ikindi Ruzgari, Afternoon Wind; Shahzad Teni, Skin of the Prince; Altan Dishli, Golden Toothed. This naming wasn't merely decorative. It reflected the Ottoman literary tradition of intertwining nature with identity. The tulip was not just a bloom, it was a character, one that could suggest a mood, a season, or even a political allegiance. Certain names were politically loaded. A tulip named Shazade Teni, for example, might signal favor toward a particular prince. Another, called Sadrazam Ishiltisi, the vizier's sparkle, might be grown to honor a powerful minister. To bestow a tulip name upon a political rival was either a subtle threat or a flattering trap. The gardens themselves became sites of silent diplomacy. During the height of the Lail Devri, it was common for foreign envoys to be invited to twilight tulip viewings. These were no casual strolls. Attendees were handed tiny, illuminated manuscripts containing diagrams of that evening's blooms. Light was provided by oil lamps placed in colored glass, the kind that made white tulips appear violet, and orange ones shimmer like bronze. Musicians played from behind rose trellises. Coffee was served in cups the size of thimbles. But most importantly, each guest was handed a tally sheet. Yes, even the guests were asked to count. Not formally, but symbolically. The message was clear: you are being shown the order of beauty, take note. As the tulip craze deepened, private citizens eager to emulate court tastes began cultivating their own varieties. The wealthy elite in districts like Ayup, Uskudar, and Galata paid small fortunes to acquire rare bulbs. Gardeners became minor celebrities. Manuals were published with instructions on soil composition, sunlight angles, and planting rituals. One such guide, Lael Yedishterman Sur Lari, The Secrets of Tulip Cultivation, included a recommended morning prayer for blooming, a list of auspicious planting dates based on the lunar calendar, and a warning to avoid planting near onions, which were believed to bring bad temperament to the flower. And yes, some tulips had temperaments. Certain breeds were described as Hysas, difficult, others as Udengas, shy. One infamous strain, called Geese Aglayan, the one who cries at night, was said to bloom only in full moonlight, and only if no one looked directly at it while watering. These were not superstitions. These were horticultural philosophies, treated with the same seriousness as religious rites or poetic forms. But what separated this period from a simple floral fad was the scale of bureaucratic involvement. Gardeners filed tulip reports. Court clerks compared bloom schedules against official ledgers. Punishments were issued for mislabeling varieties. Budgets were drafted not just for gardens, but for naming ceremonies. Yes, naming a new tulip, if it gained court favor, could result in state recognition, sometimes in the form of a monetary award or the granting of a small plot in the Hasbasseler. Naming was tightly regulated, and proposals were reviewed by a committee of scribes and poets. It is perhaps the only recorded instance in Ottoman administration where floral creativity had to pass through multiple levels of approval. And yet, this intense documentation served a purpose. It turned beauty into policy. It turned petals into a kind of currency not to be spent, but to be tracked. To count tulips was not to restrict them. It was to affirm their value and your control. Still, for all the harmony and order, something uneasy stirred beneath the bloom. The empire's borders were restless. Trade deficits grew. Janissary discipline eroded. And among the people, especially in the poorer districts of Istanbul, there was talk that the palace cared more for tulips than for bread. In 1730, those whispers would rise not like a flower but like smoke. So what happens when an empire begins to inventory its beauty? When it catalogs not weapons or treaties, but petals and perfume? Is it a mark of refinement, or the beginning of retreat? It began, as many things do in old Istanbul, with a whisper. A complaint here, a muttered remark there. A question posed, not loudly, but with the quiet bitterness that builds in coffeehouses and kitchens. How many tulips will feed a child? By 1729, The l'Île d'Ivry, the tulip era, had reached its most elaborate heights. The imperial gardens glowed with blooms of every hue. Public spectacles filled the evenings. Miniature artists painted tulips on ceramic tiles, and poets compared them to the eyes of saints and the blood of prophets. Tulips graced coins, textiles, and the corners of court decrees. But outside the garden walls, the city strained. The price of bread had doubled. The price of tulips had quadrupled. Wages stagnated. Taxes grew. The tension between aesthetic elegance and economic hardship could no longer be soothed by verses or floral inventories. And when it cracked fast. On September 28, 1730, a man named Patrona Halil, a former janissary turned bathhouse attendant, stood in the courtyard of the Fatih Mosque and called for rebellion. He was not a poet, not a gardener, not a bureaucrat, but he understood something about symbols. He did not rally against military defeat. He did not call for revenge against enemies. He called for the destruction of the tulips. This was no metaphor. Halil named Grand Vizier Damat Ibrahim Pasha as a corrupter of the empire. He accused the palace of favoring flowers over justice, of hosting nightly garden parties while bakers went bankrupt, of squandering public funds not on roads or weapons but on petals and poems. And the people, long simmering under rising food costs and failed reforms, listened. What followed is now remembered as the Patrona Halil Rebellion, a week-long uprising that would destroy much of what the tulip era had built. It was, in many ways, an aesthetic revolution. The rebels, numbering in the thousands, moved not toward the military barracks, but toward the gardens. The imperial Hasbosseler were among their first targets. Fires were set to the tulip beds. Flower beds that had taken years of grafting, breeding, and cultivation were reduced to ash in hours. Next came the mansions of the elite, especially those known for their private tulip gardens. Tiles were smashed, fountains dismantled, paintings destroyed. One chronicler wrote that the air was filled not just with smoke but the perfume of 1,000 crushed blooms. But the most symbolic blow was struck not with fire, but with paper. In the central archives of the Sublime Porte, the rebels located the l'Île d'Ivry, the tulip ledgers. These carefully maintained records, so prized for their calligraphy and categorization, were torn and scattered in the square. Fragments of names like Sultan's Lantern and Blush of the Divine floated in the breeze. Eyewitnesses said that some of the rebels read the names aloud as they burned, mocking the poetic excess of the ruling class. Others tried to pronounce the more elaborate varieties, laughing at how such words had become more familiar than prayers. And in the palace, amid the cries and chaos, Sultan Ahmed II made a choice. He dismissed Damat Ibrahim Pasha, his Grand Vizier and tulip patron. He halted all garden expenditures. And he abdicated. It was one of the few successful popular uprisings in Ottoman history. And it had been catalyzed not by invasion or plague, but by flowers. After the revolt, the tulip fell from grace. Not just in the gardens, but in language. For decades, poets avoided references to the flower. Officials distanced themselves from floriculture. Gardeners returned to growing vegetables and citrus trees seen as more practical, less dangerous. The tulip, once the crown of Ottoman elegance, became a symbol of decadence. It was called the flower that cost the empire its breath. One satirical poet from the mid-18th century referred to it as the Sultan's mistress, sweet but ruinous. The office of the tulip clerk was dissolved. The ledgers that survived were stored away, forgotten. And so the paper garden, once counted so meticulously, faded from the record. But empires do not forget entirely. In time, the tulip returned, though quietly, and without its bureaucracy. By the late 19th century, flower stalls in Istanbul once again sold bulbs. Painters once again used tulips in the margins of manuscripts. And new generations, unfamiliar with Patrona Halil, admired the flower for its elegance, not its history. In 2005, the city of Istanbul formally adopted the tulip as a symbol, declaring it part of the city's visual identity. Each spring, thousands bloom in Emergan Park, where modern visitors take photographs unaware that they are standing on the ashes of a revolt. A revolt against paperwork and petals, against the notion that beauty, when overcounted, becomes exclusion. So now, centuries later, we might ask, is it dangerous to measure beauty? To name it, catalog it, bureaucratize it? Or was it not the tulips that sparked revolt, but the exclusion they represented? Long after the fires died down and the ledgers crumbled into ash, the empire endured. And tulips, quiet, unassuming, waited. Not in gardens, not yet, but in memory, tucked between the pages of old poetry, hidden in the margins of forgotten manuscripts, pressed into the delicate patterns of Iznik tiles, still clinging to walls long after the buildings had changed names, purposes, or vanished entirely. The Lail Devri, the tulip era, was officially over by 1730. But its imprint, soft, fragile, and strangely resilient, never left Ottoman life. And in time, its bureaucratic obsession with beauty became less a cautionary tale, and more a curiously tender footnote in the long scroll of imperial routine. In the decades after the Patrona Halil rebellion, the Ottoman state grew wary of extravagance. Garden budgets were slashed, festivals curtailed, public architecture took on a more austere tone. Yet tulips never fully disappeared. In fact, a subtle revival occurred, not in the lavish gardens of sultans, but in the quiet work of civil servants. By the mid-18th century, tulip motifs had crept back into official seals, mosque tiles, and the decorative elements of bureaucratic documents. A simple, single-stem tulip would often be drawn beside the tugra, the sultan's official calligraphic signature, on imperial decrees. These were not statements of luxury, they were visual whispers. A reminder that even the most efficient machine of state, the bureaucracy, had once bent its head to admire a flower. Let us visit, for a moment, an unremarkable office in the Sublime Porte in 1764. There, a middle-ranking scribe named Hafiz Ismail carefully copied tax records from a province in eastern Anatolia. He used a worn quill. The paper, rough and slightly yellowed, bore no sign of poetry. Yet in the bottom right corner of one page, beneath a column of tobacco levies and caravan fees, Hafiz drew a tulip. Small, asymmetrical, no larger than a fingernail, but unmistakably a tulip. Why? No one told him to. It served no purpose. It did not alter the numbers. It did not delay the tax. But perhaps for a moment it reminded Hafiz of a gentler era, a story his grandfather once told of a garden by the Bosphorus, or a painting he'd seen in a mosque as a boy, or the feel of a tulip bulb in soil before the soil became ash. It was not an act of rebellion, nor was it nostalgia. It was something else. The quiet persistence of beauty in the heart of bureaucracy. As the 19th century rolled forward, the Ottoman Empire faced new challenges. Nationalism, foreign debt, war. The Tanzimat reforms reshaped governance. New ministries formed. Modern institutions replaced old ones. But through these upheavals, the tulip kept appearing, always small, always silent. It became a design on banknotes, a print on postage stamps, a symbol stitched into military uniforms. Stripped of its former extravagance, the tulip adapted. From symbol of imperial privilege, it became a symbol of Ottoman identity itself. Some historians have called this transformation a kind of floral domestication. Where once the tulip had commanded entire festivals, it now occupied the corner of a handkerchief. But in its smallness, it endured. Perhaps the most surprising rebirth came not under the Ottomans, but after them. In 1923, the Republic of Turkey was founded, the imperial system dismantled, palaces abandoned, ministries dissolved or reformed. The past, for many, was something to be transcended. Yet in the 1950s, during a wave of cultural preservation, Istanbul's municipal gardeners began planting tulips in public spaces again, not as courtly ornament, but as civic pride. The Istanbul Tulip Festival, launched in the early 2000s, now attracts millions. Every April, parks bloom with over 30 million tulips in 100-plus varieties. The species names are new and the classification modern, but the act, planting, tending, nomming, is ancient. Walk through Emergan Park or Gulhane Garden today, and you may see visitors with cameras, children holding maps of flower beds, and older residents pausing quietly beside a fountain. None of them count the tulips anymore. No ledgers are kept. No clerks are dismissed for a misnamed bloom. But the ritual remains. You could argue that in returning tulips to the people, removing them from ledgers and placing them back in soil, the empire found its closure. Or perhaps the tulips never belonged to the empire at all. Perhaps they always belonged to the soil and only visited the palace. And so we return to our quiet question. What does it mean to count beauty? To assign a number, a name, a status. To trace petals like coins and blooms like borders. In the Ottoman world, tulips were not merely admired. They were documented, recorded, audited. The flower, once ephemeral, became administrative. And when the empire fell, what remained? Not the ledgers, not the palace festivals, not even the names, but a gesture, the act of pausing in front of a bloom, of nodding its shape, its color, of nomming it quietly, maybe even privately, and walking on. You too might do this. Some spring afternoon, in a garden or a park. You might stop and stare at a flower without reason. You might name it in your head. You might not realize that, in doing so, you are echoing a vanished empire's most delicate obsession. Not because you are Ottoman, but because you are human. And we all, in the end, attempt to preserve fleeting beauty the only way we know how. We name it. We record it. We try, impossibly, to keep it from fading, even when we know it will. Story 6. Ceremonial Spoons and the Art of Serving Nothing. You sit cross-legged. A hush falls over the chamber. Velvet curtains filter the light, casting soft shadows across the polished marble floor. To your left, a janissary stands so still he might be carved from stone. To your right, a servant approaches, steps measured, bearing a small, carved wooden spoon on a silver tray. You are not hungry. There is no bowl, no stew, no rice, nothing at all. Still, you bow your head. You take the spoon in both hands, and you do not eat. This is not a meal. It is a ritual. And the spoon, light, finely carved, utterly empty, is among the most symbolically loaded tools in the Ottoman court. To an outsider, it might appear as theater. To the Ottomans, it was order. And the spoon, despite its banality, played a part in holding that order together. The Ottomans, as a political and cultural entity, were obsessed with ceremonial hierarchy. From the complex rituals of the Divan Imperial Council to the multi-stage greeting protocol for foreign emissaries, every interaction had a prescribed rhythm, a choreographed silence, and often, oddly, a utensil. Among these, one of the most overlooked, yet rigidly enforced traditions was the ceremonial spoon exchange, a performative gesture that marked presence, favor, and rank. The origins of this custom are difficult to trace with precision. Some historians believe it evolved from the early Ottoman military dining traditions, where communal meals established hierarchy not through seating arrangements, but through serving order. Others suggest its roots lie in Central Asian Turkic customs, where shared utensils denoted loyalty and trust. Regardless of its origin, by the late 16th century, the act of offering, receiving, or displaying a spoon, even one never intended to touch food, had become a formalized court ritual. In the records of the Topkapi Palace, we find detailed inventories listing spoons, not as kitchen tools, but as ceremonial objects. Ebony spoons with jade inlays, cherrywood spoons tipped with pearls, olivewood spoons inscribed with Quranic verses, gold-plated spoons reserved only for the Sultan's symbolic use. Each had a place in the ritual choreography of daily palace life, but their most curious use occurred during the Ashsabashi Marasimi, the head cook's ceremony. This event, held not annually, but whenever the Sultan desired to display internal court favor, centered on a single symbolic action. The Sultan's kitchen, known as the Matbaletter 131 Amir, would prepare a feast that no one would eat. Instead, officials would gather to watch the presentation of dishes, exquisitely arranged, richly scented, and placed along a long table. Then came the spoons. One by one, high-ranking members of the court, viziers, scribes, religious leaders, would be handed a spoon by a kitchen steward. Each recipient would bow, raise the spoon to eye level, pause, and then lower it, untouched, onto a cloth. This gesture meant, "I have received your favor. I do not need to consume it. Its presence is enough." The higher the official, the more ornate the spoon, but none of them actually used it. To do so, to stir or taste, would have been a grave insult, a sign of distrust in the Sultan's offering. Better, it was believed, to taste the intent than the substance. Foreign visitors often misunderstood this ritual. In 1593, the Venetian ambassador Giovanni Mauro described what he believed to be a silent protest among Ottoman officials who refused to eat the Sultan's food. He failed to understand the point. There was no food to eat. The offering itself, its existence, was the message. The spoon was not a utensil. It was a medium of loyalty. And to mishandle it, even unintentionally, could be catastrophic. There are several recorded cases of spoon mishaps, leading to political consequences. In 1671, a junior clerk mistakenly polished and displayed a spoon reserved for the Grand Vizier. The Vizier took it as a deliberate slight. The clerk was exiled. In 1718, a new kitchen steward handed the wrong spoon, inlaid with sapphires, to a visiting Persian emissary, rather than the one set aside for local dignitaries. The incident triggered a week-long diplomatic chill. In 1743, during the symbolic renewal of loyalty oaths, a mid-ranking janissary dropped his spoon. While some believed it was an accident, others saw it as a subtle protest. The janissary was never seen again. Such were the stakes of empty gestures. Why then did the Ottomans persist in this practice? Because the spoon ceremony created visible order. It was an act of mutual acknowledgement. The Sultan acknowledged his subjects' presence. They acknowledged his authority. The object, small, neutral, and symbolically rich, allowed for that exchange without the messiness of words or unpredictable outcomes. It also offered deniability. A spoon placed just slightly out of line might signal discontent. A pause that was a few seconds too long might hint at ambition. In the quiet theater of empire, such micro-gestures carried enormous weight. Moreover, these ceremonies were slow, repetitive, and often excruciatingly dull. And that was the point. To be bored in such a setting, to endure the rhythm of presentation, pause, placement, was to submit. The ceremony became a form of training, patience as loyalty, stillness as power. And yet, for all its rigidity, the spoon ceremony had moments of unintended poetry. In the private quarters of the harem, a different form of the ritual emerged. Here, among the women of the palace, spoon gifting became a subtle language of friendship and influence. A concubine might offer another a spoon carved from quince wood, a token of solidarity. Senior eunuchs sometimes exchanged miniature spoons as symbols of shared trust. Even within the rigid hierarchies of the palace, the spoon served as a neutral token, small enough to be passed without notice, yet meaningful enough to carry sentiment. These spoons often bore inscriptions. "I see you," "For silence shared," "A favor returned." They were rarely logged in official inventories, but they traveled quietly, steadily, through the hands of those who held little power but vast influence. Today, a visitor to the Topkapi Palace might pause at a glass case in the kitchen wing and see a row of ceremonial spoons, delicate, silent, motionless. The placard might describe them simply as Ottoman court utensils. But what they were, in truth, was language. A ritualized, bureaucratic language spoken not through mouths, but through motion. A system that elevated stillness, that assigned meaning to not eating, not speaking, and not touching. And in doing so, it preserved a form of power that could be observed but never questioned. But here's a question, hanging in the quiet air between silver trays and velvet cushions. Can meaning survive when nothing is actually done? If the spoon is never used? If the food is never eaten? If the gesture is endlessly repeated without consequence? Does the ritual still hold power? Or is it, like the spoon itself, simply touching the air? If you entered the imperial spoon registry, yes, such a thing existed, you would first hear nothing. Only the shuffle of slippers on marble, the delicate rustle of robes, the scratch of reed pens tracing calligraphy across parchment. This was the Kashik Kailmi, the spoon office, one of the most quietly absurd bureaucracies of the Ottoman state. Its task: to catalog, maintain, classify, and assign ceremonial spoons within the palace. It was not part of the palace kitchens. It was not part of the treasury. It stood on its own, an odd hybrid of logistics, art, and etiquette. And its existence says more about the Ottoman court than any battle or edict ever could. The spoon office emerged sometime during the mid-17th century, as the ceremonial role of the spoon solidified into a formal code of practice. Initially a few scribes under the Matbeletter 131 Amir, imperial kitchens, the office grew in importance as spoon rituals multiplied, not only in court banquets, but in diplomatic audiences, oath ceremonies, and religious festivals. By 1700, it had its own budget line in the imperial accounts and was divided into 3 subdivisions. Spoon Inventory Bureau, Kashik Inventor Kailmi, responsible for maintaining detailed records of every ceremonial spoon in the palace. Each was numbered, measured, weighed, and described in excruciating detail, down to grain patterns and polish. Spoon Assignment Bureau, Kashik Tayin Kailmi, handled which spoon was to be used by which individual, at which event, in which setting. A complex hierarchy dictated appropriate spoon use based on rank, proximity to the Sultan, and political favor. Spoon Restoration and Repair Bureau, Kashik Tamir Kailmi, maintained the spoons physically. Tiny chips were polished out, worn inlays replaced. Spoons that were retired ceremonially were placed in velvet-lined chests with their own scrolls of commemoration. Each spoon had a name. Each name had a story. There was the spoon called Riza Acceptance, assigned to loyal viziers. Another named Gurljid Kalmak, Remain in Shadow, given to scribes who preferred anonymity. Some spoons even bore veiled political warnings. One rare example, Akins I Bahar, Second Spring, handed once to a Janissary commander who had fallen out of favor and mysteriously returned. Consider the ledgers of the Spoon Inventory Bureau. Pages upon pages of neat Ottoman script. Entry 248. Spoon of olive wood, tip slightly curved, inlaid with 3 dots of ivory, worn along the handle edge, assigned last to Shaykhul-Islam Maimed Effendi during spring festival. Symbol, continuity. Entry 312. Cherrywood spoon with tortoiseshell inlay. Fractured during Ramadan ceremony 1698. Repaired, marked with discreet silver dot on reverse. Symbol, patience. These weren't just objects. They were metaphors made tangible. And like all things bureaucratic, they were obsessively maintained, but rarely questioned. So why all this formality for utensils that no one used? In Ottoman court culture, formality was meaning. When the Sultan offered nothing more than an empty spoon, he was offering structure, an opportunity to act correctly, to fulfill the role one had been assigned. The spoon ceremonies were never about food. They were about how power moved without motion, how authority could be seen, but never directly touched. And the spoon office ensured this delicate system functioned without disruption. Of course, there were disruptions. One incident, recorded in a faded side note in a 1732 registry volume, tells of an improper spoon substitution. A steward assigned a spoon named Sadakat Loyalty to a mid-ranking naval officer instead of the intended Sesislik Silence. The gesture was misinterpreted as a promotion. The officer boasted. His rivals protested. The vizier was questioned, and the clerk responsible was reassigned to an outpost in Bosnia. Another case, from 1755, involved a diplomatic banquet where two spoons of identical design were assigned to rival Persian envoys. The resulting tension lasted 3 weeks and required 3 personal messages from the Sultan to resolve. The spoon office responded by initiating a new policy, spoon differentiation protocols, requiring a minimum of 3 visible distinguishing features between any 2 spoons assigned within proximity of one another. These included a variance in inlay material, unique grain patterns in the wood, differentiated tip curvature, optional calligraphic scrollwork on the underside. If all else failed, a spoon could be scented with a subtle trace of rosewater or ambergris to avoid confusion. Yes, they scented the spoons. As strange as it sounds, the spoon office wasn't considered absurd in its time. It was respected. It was seen as a protector of court dignity, an institution that translated invisible hierarchies into visible form. It allowed everyone to read the room, so to speak, just by glancing at the tray. And to serve in the spoon office was not without honor. Some of its senior officials went on to become palace treasurers or chief stewards. Others retired into quiet scholarly life, writing treatises on symbolism, order, and the elegance of stillness. One such work, Kashajan Gurulcesi, The Spoon's Shadow, written in 1792 by Bashkatip Selaildin Effendi, reflected on the deeper meaning of the object. It is the most obedient of instruments. It asks nothing, it speaks nothing. And in that silence, it receives the weight of the empire's gesture. A spoon that did nothing became a conduit of everything. But even bureaucracies built on nothing eventually collapse under their own weight. By the early 19th century, reform movements swept through the Ottoman government. The Tanzimat era demanded modernization, rationalization of offices, simplification of ceremonies, and elimination of wasteful ritual. The spoon office did not survive. By 1841, its duties had been absorbed into a generalized protocol and presentation bureau. The ledgers were boxed and shelved. Many ceremonial spoons were sold, lost, or gifted to foreign dignitaries unaware of their former symbolic role. One ended up in a private collection in Vienna, labeled simply as Ottoman dessert spoon. Another now rests in a museum in Tokyo, misidentified as Persian ceremonial utensil. Even in storage, the spoons were stripped of their language. And yet some survive, hidden in drawers, Labeled incorrectly. Misunderstood. A spoon that once told a story of favor or fall. A curved piece of wood that once whispered of patience, silence, or ambition. And every so often, someone picks one up, admires the craftsmanship, and wonders, why does this feel like it meant something more? Because it did, even if that meaning was wrapped in silence. So we might now ask, if a symbol is forgotten, if the ledger is lost, if the gesture is no longer seen, does the object still carry its history? Or does the spoon, like the empire that wielded it, return to being just wood? If you open the bottom drawer in a dusty antique shop in Istanbul, say, one tucked away behind the spice bazaar or down a crooked alley in Fatty, you might find a spoon. Wooden, slightly curved, unremarkable. It may be cherry wood, olive wood, or pear. The inlay might be missing, or faintly visible, a fragment of pearl or a faded script no one's translated in years. There will be no price tag, just a quiet sense that the object has waited too long to be useful again. The seller will likely call it a kashik, just a spoon, maybe say it was for yogurt or honey or stirring tea. But you, now informed, might pause, might hold it a little longer, might wonder if this spoon once sat on a silver tray before a sultan. If it once moved nothing, touched nothing, and yet meant everything. Because not all tools are for doing. Some are for reminding. After the dissolution of the spoon office, ceremonial spoon use in the Ottoman court faded quickly. The Tanzimat reforms ushered in a new vocabulary of governance. Protocol became paperwork. Ceremonial gestures gave way to press releases, uniforms, and printed flags. But the ghost of the spoon remained. Consider the modern state ceremonial committee in the Turkish Republic today. When a visiting head of state is received, there are still precise sequences of action. Who steps out first? Who speaks? When the national anthem plays, how long the pause before the handshake? The spoon is no longer past, but its spirit, the insistence that gesture carries meaning, endures. Scholars of symbolic anthropology often return to the Ottoman spoon ritual when discussing non-functional formalism. That is, acts that perform nothing materially, yet are structured, repeated, and upheld with unwavering seriousness. The spoon ceremonies represent a heightened version of human order, a system so secure in its own power that it no longer needs to say anything. An empire so concerned with maintaining appearances, it codifies the absence of action. A people so fluent in subtlety, they build an entire office around the empty gesture. And this wasn't limited to spoons. The Ottoman court's larger culture thrived on ritualized presence. A robe laid on the floor instead of handed over. A cup filled and then set aside untouched. A horse ridden precisely to, but not past, a ceremonial threshold. In all of this, the message was the same. We understand the world without needing to say it. Let the form speak, even if the content is air. To modern eyes, this can seem comical, wasteful, pretentious. But it raises an uncomfortable question. What exactly do we do today that is truly different? Consider the ribbon-cutting ceremony for a new building. No one enters that day. The silent standing ovation for a retiring executive who already left the room. The empty reply-all email of acknowledgement. The annual performance review with no change in outcome. These are rituals of modern administration, and they are filled with spoons of our own. In a sense, the ceremonial spoon was an early form of social metadata, an encoded symbol that said, I know where I stand. You know where you stand. We are seen performing this together. No one ate. No one stirred. But everyone understood. And that understanding, fleeting, silent, easily broken, was worth preserving. The moment the wrong spoon went to the wrong person, the illusion of order crumbled. Hence the obsession with documentation, placement, handling. Power was fragile. Ceremony held it steady. There is a peculiar entry in a private journal from 1816, belonging to Hassan Aga, a minor steward in the inner palace. He recounts witnessing an old spoon being discarded. I saw with my eyes spoon 401, made of sycamore and once assigned to Kara maimed Pasha, placed into the firewood pile. No one noticed. The new steward does not even keep the spoon register up to date. He says it is irrelevant. I fear we have already lost the empire in spirit. Hassan was not a historian. He did not foresee the fall of the empire. But he understood this. When meaning is no longer maintained, silence becomes noise. And without the spoon, silent, delicate, absurd, the empire had one less way to show that it still meant something. Today, a few ceremonial spoons survive in collections. One lives in the Museum of Turkish and Islamic Arts in Istanbul. Another, unlabeled, sits behind glass in a Paris museum under the vague tag, Ottoman utensil, purpose unclear. A third, displayed in Topkapi Palace, has its own caption, symbolic spoon of the Ottoman court, used in non-dining rituals to convey status and protocol. Yet no display can recreate the moment, the breath between tray and hand, the stillness of hundreds of men not eating, the feel of a spoon raised to the eye and lowered again without a word spoken. Because what the spoon carried wasn't food. It was the performance of order. And you cannot exhibit a performance, only hint at its echo. So let us end with a quiet image. A single spoon resting on a folded cloth. The tray has been removed. The guests have gone. The room is still. And the spoon remains untouched. A final question lingers. In a world rushing toward productivity and constant output, is there still room for a gesture that means nothing, and yet holds everything together?